In this episode, I will be discussing Robert's account of Billy the Kid's famous escape from the Lincoln County Jail. Like my previous videos, I will be quoting directly from Morrison's tape-recorded interviews with William V. Morrison, as well as quotes from the book, alias Billy the Kid, by Morrison and Sonnichsen. I will also be comparing Robert's account of the event with those depicted in the book, The Saga of Billy the Kid, by Walter Noble Burns, to show that the new theory adopted by neo-historians that Roberts obtained his knowledge of Billy the Kid by memorizing the Burns book is completely unfounded and not based on evidence. With that said, let's examine Robert's statements and see if they can be verified by sources. According to William V. Morrison and Dr. C.L. Sonnichsen in the book alias Billy the Kid, quote, "What happened in the Lincoln County Jail in 1881 was still giving Brushy Bill Roberts the horrors 69 years later. In August 1950, he came back to Lincoln for the first time in many decades. He was riding with William V. Morrison, who was on his way to Carrizozo to go through the records in the county courthouse. They stopped in front of the place where Billy the Kid passed the long days and nights waiting for his death sentence to be carried out. Roberts was very uneasy and cried intermittently. He refused to get out of the car and go inside. Morrison went in alone and had a chat with Mr. Wright, who was pinch hitting for Colonel Fulton, the custodian. That night, after Morrison had gone through the records in Carrizozo, they talked far into the small hours about what had happened in the old days. But it was not until the next morning, when they were back trailing towards Roswell, that things began to come alive for the old man. The country had changed so much, but Roberts was still able to locate and describe the terrain, recalling images from his past as they came into view. Pointing to the mountainside, on the right, over there, was a rock ledge that we used to ride out on and fire down into the valley. A little farther down on the other side of the road, we ought to see a cave we used to use. Sure enough, the cave came into view. A man could get a horse in there, he remarked. Back in Lincoln, he still refused to visit the old courthouse. But just as they reached the outskirts of town, headed for Roswell, he changed his mind. Let's go back to that place. I might go inside if there's nobody there. I want to go inside. He sat in the car while Morrison reconnoitered. Mr. Wright was still the only official present, so Brushy Bill got out and came in. Mr. Wright was very courteous and showed them some of his relics. They came to a pair of leg irons of the type Billy was wearing when he made his escape. Bill thought Mr. Wright was passing them off as the genuine originals, took offense, and nearly let his tongue run away with him. "Them are not the leg irons that Billy the Kid rode out of here with. I ought to know that. Billy's leg irons were cut apart in the middle of the chain." Then he bethought himself, turned red, counted the links in the chain to the number of 14, and agreed that the shackles were of the type that he wore. When Mr. Wright's back was turned, he whispered to Morrison, "If you think it's safe, I would like to go up there and show you where I was locked to the floor in that room on the corner." Morrison reassured him, and they climbed the stairs to the second floor. Upstairs, Brushy Bill seemed nervous and somehow lost, as if he were trying to find a familiar landmark in a wilderness. The stairs inside were about the way they had been, but he remarked that there was no outside stairway to the balcony in the old days. The upper floor was completely changed. He explained to Morrison how it looked in 1881. The stairway began on the first floor on the west side, running east into the large hall, which ran north and south in the building. At the east end of this hall, a door opened into Garrett's office. On the east side of Garrett's office, a door opened into the room where I was confined in the northeast corner room. Across the hall from Garrett's office door was another door opening to the armory room. We walked over to one of the eastern windows. I was sitting right here on a soapbox that morning when Olinger loaded his shotgun with buckshot, 12 in each barrel. He snarled at me as usual and said, "Kid, do you see these buckshot I am loading into these 2 barrels? 12 in each barrel? Well, if you try to make a break, I'll put all 24 between your shoulder blades." I said, "Bob, you might get them before I do," and I smiled at him. Then he brought out a lariat rope and said, "This is good enough to hang you with." I told him a lariat rope was not fit to hang a man with. At noontime, as usual, Olinger went across the street with the other prisoners for lunch and left Bell there, guarding me. Olinger and Bell were always on guard duty. Olinger always brought me lunch in when he came back. Then Bell would go for lunch. During the week I was kept here, I was guarded constantly. They were afraid I would break jail or would be rescued by my friends. It seemed that Bell lived in the neighborhood of White Oaks. He was a nice man. He treated me like an ordinary prisoner. But Olinger treated me like a dog. Olinger wasn't nothing to him. A big bluff and a big coward. Killed all his men by shooting in the back or before they knew what was happening. He was a big fellow, too. Garrett didn't like him either. I think the Beckwith family was related to Ollinger's, but I'm not sure. Beckwiths were all right when they came to that country, until Murphy turned them against Chisholm, who helped them out when they came to that country. Old John helped lots of them in that day. Olinger had worked for Chisholm and was not liked by any of the boys. He had shot John Jones in the back in a camp on the Pecos. He murdered John Jones in cold blood. I promised the father I would even the score with Olinger for this murder of his son. During my trial in Mesilla, he kept taunting and teasing me. I was eager to kill him, but I didn't want to kill Bell. The day before I got away, Sam Corbett and his wife came in to see me. Sam had hit a six-shooter in the latrine, so the next morning I planned to wait until Olinger had taken the other prisoners to lunch and Bell would be alone with me, when I would ask him to take me to the latrine. I expected him to take me in there and I would come out of shooting, but I didn't need Sam's six-shooter. Olinger has gone to lunch. Bell and I are alone in the building. I'm sitting about here on a box, handcuffed, shackled, and chained to this floor with a lock. Bell is sitting over by that window and reading a paper. I asked Bell to unlock this chain and take me to the latrine downstairs. At first he objected, said he didn't know. Then he went into that room, Garrett's office, and got the key to unlock this chain. At this moment, I slipped my right hand from the cuff, and holding them in my left, I hit him in the back of the head. He tumbled over the floor. When he came up, he was looking down the barrel of his own six-shooter. I told him that I would not hurt him if he would do as I said. I told him to walk through that office and unlock the armory door, as I wanted to lock him in there until I could escape. Without saying a word, he walked through the office. When he stepped into the hall, he ran for the stairway. With the 14-inch chain between my leg irons, I could not run, so I jumped and slid across the floor to the left towards the stairs. When he reached the third or fourth step, my left hand was nearing the stairs. I pulled the trigger, and the bullet struck the wall on that side. It must have ricocheted and struck him under the arm, coming out on the other side. Bell fell down the steps, dying as he fell. I turned and scuttled back to the office, where I picked up Ollinger's shotgun, where he stood it against the wall that morning. I went over to my window. When I looked out, I saw Olinger and another man coming over across the street toward the jail. Just as Olinger came across the street, he put his six-shooter into the scabbard. He probably thought that Bell had killed me in the jail. As he came near the corner of the building, beneath my window, I leveled down on him, saying, "Look up, Bob. I want to shoot you in the face with your own buckshot. I don't want to shoot you in the back like you did other men, and the Jones boy." The buckshot struck him in the breast, killing him instantly. Then I fired the other 12 into him. I wanted him to get all of them like he had promised to give them to me. I wanted him to know that I was the man who was killing him. This was the happiest moment of my life. I promised to give him his own buckshot while he was loading his gun that morning. He shot the Jones boy in the back and the neck, killing him. He threatened to put the shot from both barrels in my back, and he would have done it if he would have had the chance. That was his way of killing other men, but he did not die that way. I went downstairs and out the other side at the bottom of the stairs, where Old Man Goss and someone else were standing near Bell's body. I told Goss to cut this chain between my legs. He tried to cut it with a saw. I told him to get the axe and cut it, and be damn careful where he hit the chain. I held a .44 on him. He cut the chain as I stood over the rock. I took a cord and tied each end of the chain to my belt so I could straddle a horse. Goss caught the horse behind the jail in the pasture. He and the Gallegos boy saddled the horse and took him to the front of the jail. I went back upstairs to this armory room and picked up a .44 Winchester belt loaded with cartridges and crossed it over my other shoulder, picking up a Winchester and two .44 single-action Colts with scabbards. As I walked out on the balcony upstairs here, everything was calm, with no one trying to catch me. No one wanted to fight. I called out that if anyone was looking for a 6-foot grave, that they should follow me. I went back downstairs and out the front of the jail where the horse was tied. I jumped for the saddle but slid off the other side, hanging to the rope. The Gallegos kid went down the road and took a rope off of a yoke of steers in the field and tied it to my saddle. I got on the horse and rode out of Lincoln to the west and up the canyon to the home of a friend who cut the bolts in my leg irons. After they screwed the nuts on the bolts, they riveted over the ends of the bolts so I couldn't unscrew them with my hands." End quote. Sonnichsen further described the effect the ordeal played on Roberts as he relived them. All the while this recital was going on, the old man was in tears and greatly excited. It was as much as he could stand to be in that room. He took one last look around and headed for the stairs. Morrison loaded him into the car and they drove off. They passed the building twice in later expeditions, but Brushy Bill would never go back inside. One time Colonel Fulton came out to shake hands and ask him in, but once was enough. He would not get out of that car. After leaving the building, he had an idea that he would like to see if he could retrace his escape route up the canyon, but the country had changed so much since the last time he was there that he couldn't see too much that looked familiar. Morrison turned around and headed toward Roswell, Brushy Bill filling in more as they drove. Quote, "I turned the horse back for Lincoln and walked over the mountain. My guns began to get heavy, and I hung one of them in the fork of a tree. I was headed for the house of Eno Salazar. We had been friends for a long time. I had stayed with him and his mother before. Neither of us were married. His brother might have been married, but I don't remember. I know if I could reach his house across the mountain, he would help me as much as he could. Eno was the one who escaped from the burning McSween building. He was seriously injured, but he recovered. I walked near the house and whistled several times before he came outside. He recognized me, and we talked about my escape. He urged me to leave for old Mexico. I argued that I would not leave the country until I killed John Chisholm, Barney Mason, and Pat Garrett. He went back in the house and brought a blanket for me. I slept in the underbrush, as I thought a posse would be looking for me, and I did not expect to die alone. Next day, he brought food to me. On the second day, he borrowed a horse, and I started for Fort Sumner across the plains. I told him about hanging my pistol in the tree, and he tried to find it, but he never could. While on my way, the horse broke loose and left me on foot again. I walked into Anaya's sheep camp below Fort Sumner and stayed a few days. I traveled at night and slept in the daytime. I expected Garrett down at Fort Sumner, hunting for me. After dark one evening, I walked to the home of Charlie Beaudry's widow, where I spent the night and the next day or so. From here, I rode back to Garcia's. I stayed around Fort Sumner with some ranchers and herders for about 2.5 months before I had the fight with Garrett's posse that night in July. I would not leave until I killed Mason, Chisholm, and Garrett. It was about the middle of May 1881 when I rode out to old John's ranch on South Spring. I met a Mexican cowboy. I pulled down on him, telling him to go in and bring old John out so I could talk to him face to face. He told me that old John had left the country when I broke jail over in Lincoln, and that he would not be back. I threatened to kill him if old John did not come out. He kept insisting that old John was not in there. I promised him that I would kill him if I found out that he was lying to me. I stayed at a camp nearby for a few days, watching and waiting until I found out that the Mexican was telling the truth. I left there looking for Barney Mason. He started to ride up to the camp where I was staying. When I came out, he left, and mighty quick too he did. I could have killed him if I had known it was him. I sent a note to Garrett that I was waiting for him, and that he had better come a-shooting too. Barney and Pat were related by marriage, so I understood. They had both been good friends of mine until Chisholm and others had Garrett elected sheriff of Lincoln County. We rode and gambled together. Mason rustled cattle and horses with us after Garrett was elected, but when he started squealing to Garrett, we ran him off. I knew Celsa and Pat's wife, who were sisters to Saville Gutierrez, before Pat came to this country. Celsa was one of my sweethearts when I was in Fort Sumner. Her brother, Saville, lived in Fort Sumner. After I returned from hunting old John, he went up to Canaditas and got Celsa for me. She wanted to go to Mexico with me, but I did not want to get married until Garrett was gone. While I was in Fort Sumner, I stayed at Gutierrez's, Jesus Silva's, and Beaudry's. I also stayed at the Yerby Ranch, north of Fort Sumner, quite a bit. We were good friends. I kept horses and mules there when Charlie Beaudry worked for Yerby. He had a good-looking daughter, who was sort of a sweetheart of mine. I don't remember her name. Fort Sumner had some good-looking girls in those days. Most of my time was spent at the Yerby Ranch after I broke jail in Lincoln. There were several cow and sheep camps on the road from Yerby's to Fort Sumner. I stopped off in most of them during the daytime." End quote. The cave described by Roberts was Fox Cave, and Roberts' claim that the cave was once used as a hideout for Billy the Kid is confirmed in the book Towns of Lincoln County by John LeMay, who stated, quote, "It was once used as a hideout by William H. Bonney, better known as Billy the Kid, and also known as Henry Antrim, a 19th century American gunman who participated in the Lincoln County War and became a frontier outlaw in the American Old West." End quote. Billy the Kid escaped from the Lincoln County Jail on Thursday, April 28, 1881. There have been many versions of Billy the Kid's famous escape. According to the version presented by Pat Garrett via Ash Upson in his book The Authentic Life of Billy the Kid, while Olinger was taking the other prisoners to eat, Billy convinced Bill to escort him to the outhouse, and upon returning, as the two men re-entered the building, Billy ran up the stairs, gaining considerable distance between he and Bell, and was able to break into the armory, seize a pistol, and shoot Bell at the bottom of the stairs, all while wearing leg shackles. In Pat Garrett, The Man Behind the Badge, by W.C. Jameson, he states, quote, "There is, frankly, little logic attached to this event, the way Garrett described it. The lawman could not possibly have had any knowledge about what transpired in the courthouse, since he was not there, nor was anyone else nearby to witness what occurred. It is unlikely that Bell, a veteran and experienced lawman, would have allowed an outlaw as notorious as Billy the Kid to get so far ahead of him on returning from the outhouse." Garrett stated that Bell was 12 steps below on the stair, and that this was after the Kid had time to step through the door to the armory and grab a revolver. This sequence was entirely made up by Garrett. End quote. Another version has it that Sam Corbett wrapped a pistol in a newspaper and hid it in the privy, where Billy retrieved it. Following his departure from the privy, Billy proceeded back to the jail, where once he reached the head of the stairs toward his second-floor confinement, he pulled down on Bill and killed him. However, according to Donald Klein, an alias Billy the Kid, the man behind the legend, quote, "Some have made the statement that Bonnie obtained a pistol left in the outhouse and used it on Bell. This is untrue. Pat Garrett located the pistol shortly after the escape." End quote. If Klein's statement is true, then this confirms Roberts' account that Corbett placed the revolver in the outhouse, but that he made his move on Bell before acquiring it, which made it possible for Garrett to find it later on. Roberts' account differs significantly from the accepted version. However, evidence exists which seems to corroborate Roberts' account of the killing of Bell. On May 3, 1881, the following item appeared in the Santa Fe New Mexican. Quote, "Bell lay dead in the backyard with one bullet through him and 2 gashes on his head, apparently from handcuffs." End quote. Several years following the Kid's famous escape from the Lincoln County Jail, researcher, author, and historian Colonel Maurice G. Fulton interviewed one of the Kid's former friends, John Meadows. According to Meadows, Billy explained to him how he was able to make his great escape. He stated, quote, "The Kid slipped the cuff off of one wrist and swung the loose end in vicious blows that opened 2 gashes in Bell's scalp." End quote. This account matches Roberts and explains the gashes on Bell's head. If Billy had obtained a revolver from the outhouse or from elsewhere, as hypothesized by some, then why would he need to hit Bell with his handcuffs at all? According to a letter dated April 29, 1881, from probate judge James Tomlinson to Justice of the Peace Jesus Larez, after Billy rode out of Lincoln, Bell and Ollinger's bodies were moved to, quote, "a room in the corral of the courthouse in the town of Lincoln," end quote. And on the following day, April 30th, 1881, Tomlinson and Larez assembled a coroner's jury and conducted an inquest over the bodies, which stated, quote, "The bodies of Robert Olinger and J.W. Bell, found in precinct number 1 of the county of Lincoln, find that the said deceased Robert Olinger and J.W. Bell both come to their deaths by reason of gunshot wounds inflicted on them by William Bonney, alias Kid, on the 28th day of April A.D. 1881 at the courthouse in Lincoln, while the said William Bonney, alias Kid, was being held in custody for the murder of William Brady and awaiting his execution upon conviction for that crime, and that said Olinger and Bell, who were guarding him, was murdered by said Bonney, alias Kid, in making his escape from custody." End quote. The report was signed by Jesus Larez, Justice of the Peace, and 5 jurors. 3 of the jurors' signatures were affixed at the bottom of the document: Isidor Chavez, Ramon Luan, and Juan Chavez y Montola. 2 of the jurors, Gabriela Marquez and Burnaby May, signed with their mark. Pat Garrett arrived back in Lincoln on the 30th of April and was appointed as administrator of Ollinger's estate on May 6, 1881. When Garrett listed Ollinger's possessions on his body at the time of his death, he doesn't mention any handguns, only the shotgun which he listed as broken and of no value. Apparently Garrett played fast and loose with Ollinger's property, taking Ollinger's last $50 owed him by the county, stating that Ollinger owed him $84 for a loan. He further stated that Ollinger had nothing else of value and filed for final settlement of the estate and to be discharged. However, Garrett would later gift Ollinger's shotgun, the gun Billy used to kill him, a 10-gauge Winchester, serial number 903, to Joseph Smith Lay. According to the Providence letter dated July 25, 1963, from attorney Hiram Dow to John Boylan, curator of the Old Lincoln Memorial, states that Garrett gave the shotgun to Mr. Lee, quote, out of gratitude for some favors Mr. Lee had granted Mr. Garrett, end quote. According to Steve Cedarwall in The Dirty on Billy the Kid, quote, according to the letter, Garrett paid off a debt with a shotgun he swore to the court had no value, end quote. Furthermore, Ollinger was known to carry 2 revolvers on a belt, known as a brace, on him at all times. This was confirmed by Texas Ranger J.B. Gillette in a letter dated February 21, 1923, during which he recalls witnessing Ollinger guarding the Kid, stating, quote, on the rear seat sat the 2 guards. One was Bob Ollinger, the man killed by the Kid some 6 weeks or 2 months later. Each of these guards wore a brace of pistols and carried in their hands double-barreled shotguns. End quote. According to Mary Hudson Brothers, in Billy the Kid, the most hated, the most loved outlaw New Mexico ever produced, Ollinger died with his 2.45 revolvers in his possession and his broken shotgun laying on his body. In the book, My Girlhood Among Outlaws, by Lily Casey Klasner, and notated by historian Eve Ball, who documents Ollinger's possessions, stating, quote, after Ollinger's death, Lily Casey was given his 6-shooter, field glasses, and gauntlets, end quote. Lily Casey Klasner's claim of possessing at least one of Ollinger's revolvers was confirmed by 2 additional sources, the first being John Cooper, a rancher from near the Hondo Valley, who told Steve Cedarwall he knew Lily Klasner and saw the gun one time, and that she would carry it in a big black satchel bag that she would tie behind her saddle, and on one occasion they were in a store and she tossed the bag up on the counter and the gun rolled out across the counter. This was further confirmed by Eve Ball, who recounted a similar story told by Ola Casey Jones, Lily Klasner's niece, who mentioned a trunk which contained her papers and the big black satchel, and stated that it contained something of much historic interest. The satchel, according to Ball, was, quote, originally designed to be carried behind a saddle, end quote. Mrs. Klasner specified to Eric Bruce, who was helping her get her manuscript published, that in the event of her death, her niece was to receive these items. Unfortunately, the items were destroyed in a fire not long after her death in 1946. George Washington Mitchell was appointed as administrator of Bell's estate on May 6, 1881. Like Ollinger, no revolver or handgun was listed among his possessions on his body at the time of his death. This supports Robert's contention that he shot Bell with his own gun. Supporters of the historical status quo maintain that Bill still had his revolver in his holster when he was shot by the Kid. However, the source is second-hand at best, originating from a man named Lucien Dills, who claims that Garrett told him this later on. However, if true, then why was it not listed among Bell's property, and why did Garrett fail to mention it in his book, The Authentic Life of Billy the Kid, as it's a significant detail that should be noted, especially coming from a lawman. I believe Garrett probably started telling stories like this to support the ridiculous version presented in his book. In Billy the Kid, A Short and Violent Life, Robert Utley casts further doubt on Dill's account, stating, quote, Judge Lucius Dills, a turn-of-the-century New Mexico attorney with a passion for history, had proved that after the shooting, Bell's pistol was still in the holster, fully loaded. I have not seen this proof, but if it resembles other Dill's essays in history that I have seen, it is highly suspect. End quote. No matter what one thinks of Dill's credibility, his information was purportedly obtained from Pat Garrett, who I would not consider a reliable source, and cannot be relied upon to give truthful information on this matter, as he was a party of interest, and was trying to protect his image, and perhaps cause a little misdirection. If Bell's revolver was still in its holster when he was killed, then what happened to it? Certainly if it was left, then someone would have acquired it, or Garrett would have sold it. For instance, according to Steve Cedarwall, quote, concerning Olinger's pistol, we know that Garrett did not list the pistol in the court records. We also know there's a picture of Olinger and Tony Nese with the pistol at Olinger's feet. We know Ranger Gillette saw Olinger wearing a brace of pistols. We know no deputy is going to take 5 prisoners accused of murder anywhere unarmed. We know Bell Hudson says Olinger died with 2 .45s in his hands. We also know historian Eve Ball recorded that Lily Klasner ended up with Olinger's 6-shooter. We have to ask, are all these people lying, or is Garrett a thief? End quote. Supporters of the historical status quo often point to Robert's account of his escape from the Lincoln County Jail as proof that he simply mirrored the description given by Walter Noble Burns. However, the account given by Burns in the Saga of Billy the Kid is vastly different than the account given by Roberts. Here is Burns' account of the kid's escape. Quote, it was the dinner hour in Lincoln. Olinger rose and stretched himself. I'll step over to the hotel and put on the feed bag, Bell, he said. Won't be gone over an hour. When I come back, you can go for grub. He turned at the door and patted the shotgun held in the crook of his arm. 18 buckshot, kid, he snarled. Don't forget what I said. Make a break, and you get him right between your shoulder blades. On his way out of the building by the back stairs, he stopped at the armory and stood his shotgun against the wall just inside the door. Standing at the east window, Billy the Kid watched him swagger down the road to LaRue's store. A cryptic, unpleasant little smile hung for a moment at the corner of the kid's mouth. End quote. So far we have discrepancies to note between Roberts and Burns' accounts. First, Roberts has Olinger departing for lunch with the other prisoners across the street, which was the Wortley Hotel, whereas Burns has Olinger at the dinner hour walking alone down the street to LaRue's store, when in fact, he actually went to the Wortley Hotel with the other prisoners. Roberts' account is confirmed by the following sources. In High Noon in Lincoln, Violence on the Western Frontier, acclaimed Billy the Kid and Lincoln County war historian Robert Utley states, quote, at noon, Olinger escorted the other county prisoners across the street to the Wortley Hotel for lunch. End quote. There is some dispute as to the time of day that the kid made his escape from the Lincoln County Jail, as some claim it occurred at noon, while others claim 5 or 6 o'clock in the afternoon. According to Ramon Adams, in A Fitting Death for Billy the Kid, the primary source for the later time given for the escape was Charles Siringo, stating, quote, most writers say that Olinger was across the street at the Wortley Hotel for his noon meal when Bell was killed, but Siringo says he went to the Ellis Hotel at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. End quote. Adams questions Siringo's credibility, as he apparently changed his story 3 different times in 3 separate publications, and no independent source exists that supports his contentions. According to former Lincoln County Sheriff George Curry, in his self-titled autobiography, he wrote, quote, many stories have been written about the kid's escape, most of them conflicting in detail. The only witnesses as to just how the kid freed his gun hand was the guard Bell, who died when the kid's gun flamed. On April 20th, Sheriff Garrett and his chief deputy Leah were in White Oaks on official business. At noontime, Deputy Bob Olinger took 2 prisoners, in jail for minor offenses, across the street to the hotel for food. While Olinger was gone, Bell took the kid to the laboratory just outside the first floor. End quote. Frederick Nolan, in the Lincoln County War, A Documentary History, writes, quote, At noon, the following day, Olinger took the prisoners from Mrs. Lloyd's room across to the Wortley Hotel for their midday meal. End quote. Nolan goes on to state the following regarding the dispute over the time, stating, quote, "The fact that it's midday one moment, evening the next, may be explained by the fact that the evening was a contemporary Southwesternism that meant afternoon. By all accounts, the kid rode out of Lincoln at about 3 p.m." End quote. Continuing now with Burns' account, who has Billy and Bell playing cards, stating, quote, "Now Bell took a seat in a chair at the table, and Billy, as was his habit, perched himself on the tabletop, his shackled feet resting on the seat of a chair. 'You bank, Bell,' said the kid. 'I'll buck the game.' The kid shot one shrewd, furtive glance at Bell's six-shooter. Bell was wearing it today without a scabbard, stuck down his pants leg on his right side between his shirt and his belt. As Bell sat down, its muzzle rammed into his flesh. With a casual gesture, he adjusted it, pushing the handle slightly farther back toward his hip. Then taking up the deck, he shuffled it with the ease of old familiarity, rifling the cards like a faro dealer, giving them deft cuts that made a slapping noise. 'Help yourself to chips out of the matchbox, kid,' he said. 10 matches the limit on a card.' 'Bueno muchacho,' Bell began to deal. He pulled a few cards from the deck and laid them face up on the table. His monte layout began to assume form. 'I'm out for blood this game,' warned the kid jovially. 'Coffee talks. Bet $10 on that deuce of diamonds.' The kid and Bell continued playing cards and casually talking. The whole time Billy kept inching himself closer and closer to Bell. When Billy reached out his manacled hands to place his wager of 10 matches, when seemingly by accident, he brushed the jack of hearts off onto the floor at Bell's left side. 'Didn't mean to do that, Bell,' he apologized. 'Hard to play with handcuffs on like this.' 'That's all right, kid. I'll get it.' Bell bent over to pick up the card, holding the deck in his left hand. He reached for the card with his right. To do so, he had to turn slightly away from the table. For a fraction of a second, his head dipped below the level of the top, his eyes intent upon the card on the floor. It was Billy the Kid's chance in a million, for which he had been waiting for weeks with the deadly patience of a panther. As Bell stooped, the butt of his six-shooter projected within reach of the kid's hand. Leaning across the table, the kid snatched the weapon. When Bell raised his head, he was now looking into the muzzle of his own gun. He rose to his feet, knocking over the chair. He staggered back a step, his face abruptly white, his eyes wide. "What the hell, kid?" "Do as I tell you, Bell, and be might quick about it," ordered the kid in crisp, sharp tones. "Don't make a false move. You're a dead man if you do." "I don't want to kill you. I'm not going to kill you. You've been good to me. Turn and walk out the door. I'm going to lock you in the armory." Bell hesitated. The tables had been turned so quickly, he could not for a moment grasp the desperateness of the crisis. "Quick," snapped the kid. "No time to waste." Bell faced about, silently, and marched out the door. The kid, hampered by his leg irons, shuffling after him. He turned south in the hall. A sudden surge of anger, chagrin, hurt pride swept through him. Why had he been such an easy dupe, deaf to repeated warnings? He had been caught napping. End quote. Burns has Bell go through about a half of a page reflecting and thinking through his options when, quote, "He came to the head of the back of the stairs, just beyond which was the armory door. He shot a furtive glance over his shoulder. The kid had fallen perhaps 6 feet behind him, making awkward progress, his ankle chains clattering. There was not more than a dozen steps from the upper floor to the point where the stairway turned. Once behind the angle of the wall, Bell would be safe. The stairs were his one forlorn hope. Swerving sharply, he plunged down them in one flying leap. He made the bend. His outthrust hand struck the plastered wall. The heels of his cowboy boots cut splinters from the steps as he lunged for the shelter of the turn. One step more and the wall would shield him. But behind him was the quickest, deadliest coordination of eye, mind, and muscle in the Southwest. At that instant, the kid sprang to the head of the stairs, almost before his hobbled feet struck the floor. His six-shooter caught fire. The hall shook with a deafening report. The bullet struck Bell beneath the left shoulder blade, cut through his heart, and buried itself in the wall beyond. He pitched forward on his head, crumpled over in a somersault, rolled down the few remaining steps, and lay lifeless at the bottom, his limp body half out the courtyard door. The kid paid no further attention to Bell." End quote. Burns next has Billy, quote, "jamming Bell's six-shooter into his belt for emergencies. He stepped to the door of the armory, flung it open, caught up Olinger's shotgun leaning against the wall within arm's reach. Turning, he sped through the hall with strange swiftness, with strange noiselessness, gauging his quick staccato steps to the exact reach of his ankle chains. Like a fitting shadow, he curved into the courtroom, glided across the floor, and halted against the wall by the east window. From the moment Bell fell dead on the back stairs until now, the clock of eternity had ticked perhaps 10 seconds." End quote. Burns then has Billy reflecting on what just happened for about a half a page, and has Olinger having a drink with Dolan and talking about the kid's pending execution at LaRue's before walking over to the Wortley Hotel to eat when he hears a crashing noise that sounded like a gunshot coming from the courthouse. Olinger then pulls his six-shooter and heads across the street to the courthouse to investigate, believing Bell probably shot the kid. As Olinger crossed the street, he was greeted with, "Hello, Bob," he continued. Almost directly above him was the kid, leaning half out of the window. Ollinger's own shotgun loaded with 18 buckshot pressed tightly against his shoulder. Over the shining length of the double barrel gleamed the kid's hard gray eyes and the kid's cold white face. He was smiling. Olinger stopped dead in his tracks. It may have been the shock of surprise that stopped him. It may have been the paralysis of fear. It may have been the helpless realization that he was at the end of his journey of life. Everything. His cocked six-shooter hung useless in his hand at his side. He stared up at the kid with a startled, foolish, hopeless look. His eyes popped half out of their sockets. His mouth fell open. The kid pulled the trigger. All Lincoln heard the roar of the gun. A puff of blue, acrid smoke drifted off into the street. 9 buckshot struck Olinger in the breast. The impact spun him half around. He lunged forward and measured his length on the ground, his arms outstretched, his cocked six-shooter still grasped in his hand. End quote. Roberts' claim that Olinger killed John Jones and his promise to the family that he would avenge his death was verified in Alias Billy the Kid by Morrison and Sonnichsen, which cites a letter dated June 23, 1950, from Pat Schaefer to William B. Morrison, which states, quote, "You spoke of the death of a Jones as reported to Governor Wallace. That, no doubt, was John Jones. They thought well of each other, and when Olinger killed John, Billy sent word to the Jones family that he would get the man who killed him." End quote. Mrs. Schaefer is Bill Jones' granddaughter-in-law. Roberts' description of where Bell was shot was verified by Pat Garrett, who examined the bodies of the 2 slain deputies upon his return to Lincoln on the 30th of April, stating in his book, The Authentic Life of Billy the Kid, quote, "It was found that Bell was hit under the right arm, the ball passing through the body and coming out under the left arm and buried itself in an adobe on the left." End quote. According to Steve Cedarwall, in The Dirty on Billy the Kid, he writes, quote, "It is widely believed Garrett dug the bullet from the wall, or he wouldn't have been able to say the ball had surely been indented and creased before it entered the body, as these scars were filled with flesh." End quote. Cedarwall then recalls that on January 30th, 2005, Ron Hadley and Bob Doc Sproul used metal detectors to scan the wall where it was believed that the bullet would be. However, they failed to find a bullet, only a metal pipe and some wire. While the only known witnesses to what occurred inside the Lincoln County Jail that day were Bell and the kid. However, Godfrey Goss, a 58-year-old German immigrant and former priest, was outside the courthouse when Bell was shot by Billy. On January 15, 1890, he told the White Oaks Leader newspaper that, quote, "That memorable day I came out of my room, whence I had gone to light my pipe, and was crossing the yard behind the courthouse, when I heard a shot fired. A tussle upstairs in the courthouse, somebody hurrying downstairs, and Deputy Sheriff Bell emerging from the door running toward me." End quote. Goss's recollections placed Bell upstairs or on the second-floor landing and hurrying downstairs. Roberts' account of the killing of Bell was further supported by forensic science. On August 1, 2004, forensic scientist Dr. Henry Lee, United States Marshal historian Dave Turk, crime scene investigator Cal Osler, Lincoln County Sheriff Gary Graves, former police officer and U.S. criminal investigator Steve Cedarwall, and a television producer, Bill Curtis, met at the Lincoln County Courthouse and conducted a crime scene investigation in an effort to determine the facts surrounding the killing of Bell and Olinger and Billy the Kid's escape. According to author W.C. Jameson, in the book Pat Garrett, The Man Behind the Badge, he writes, quote, "Upon the boards of the landing, O-tolidine, a chemical presumptive test reagent for blood, was applied. Dr. Lee, using a Q-tip, swabbed the chemical reagent into the cracks between the boards. This done, he applied another chemical to the end of the Q-tip, causing it to turn blue. This precise reaction indicated a positive for blood residue." End quote. Dr. Henry Lee's forensic examination report, case number 2003-274, dated May 22, 2004, which can be found in The Dirty on Billy the Kid by Stephen Cedarwall. In the book Cold Case, Billy the Kid, Investigating History's Mysteries by W.C. Jameson, it states, quote, "A thorough examination of Lincoln County Courthouse records by Stephen Cedarwall revealed only one instance where blood was shed in the building, and that occurred during the escape of Billy the Kid and the shooting of Deputy James Bell. Dr. Lee has found evidence of Bell's blood on the second-floor landing, a significant amount of it. The evidence indicated that Bell bled heavily at this location." End quote. In Pat Garrett, The Man Behind the Badge, author W.C. Jameson writes, quote, "William Henry Roberts stated that, after slipping one of his handcuffs, he had severely beaten Bell about the head several times. The scalp is highly vascular. That is, it contains numerous blood vessels. Head wounds, therefore, have the potential to bleed profusely. Roberts then states that Bell stepped into the hall and made a break for the stairs. The physical activity of his fight, along with the associated panic from the beating and the escape attempt, generated a massive release of adrenaline in Bell, accompanied by an increased heart rate and blood pressure, causing the blood from his head wound to flow freely. By the time Bell reached the landing at the top of the stairs, it can be reasonably assumed that blood was dripping from his head. If only for an instant, Bell paused at the landing prior to bounding down the stairs. He either saw, heard, or intuited that Billy the Kid was in pursuit only a few steps behind him. Shuffling along the hallway as best as his shackles would permit, Bell paused long enough to allow a significant amount of blood from his wounds to drip into the landing at this point. The origin of the stains detected by Dr. Henry Lee's crime scene investigation decades later. When Bell's corpse was examined by a physician a short time later in a room adjacent to a corral behind the courthouse, it was noted that he had massive head wounds." End quote. The presence of blood at the top of the stairs, where according to Roberts he hit Bell on the head, was confirmed by none other than John Poe's wife, Sophie Poe. In Cold Case, Billy the Kid, Investigating History's Mysteries by W.C. Jameson, he states, quote, "John and Sophie took up residence in one of the rooms of the courthouse, and during their time there, Sophie complained often of the bloodstains at the top of the stairs on the landing." End quote. In The Dirty on Billy the Kid by Steve Cedarwall, he writes, quote, 2 years and 2 months after Bell was killed, Sophie Poe said the back stairway was still stained with blood. She mopped, and still the stain from James Bell's blood remained on the floor. Looking up under the stairwell from the first floor, you will notice the underside of the second-story floorboards at the head of the stairs are visible. To this day, the stains from Sophie Poe's mop water can be seen, but she was unable to completely remove James Bell from that spot. End quote. Sophie Poe's statements can be found in her book, Buckboard Days. Roberts' claim that he placed one of the guns in a fork in a tree was confirmed by his friend Jesus Silva, who retrieved the gun, and later traded the single-action Colt, serial number 22334, a .45 caliber with a 7.5-inch barrel to Milton Brown for a Colt revolving rifle. Milton gave the gun to his son-in-law Maurice Cummins, who later passed the gun to his son Ben. The gun would later be sold at auction and was purchased by Robert Weller on May 12, 1998, who received the following provenance letter with a revolver which states, quote, "On April 28, 1881, William H. Bonney, Billy the Kid, killed his guards J.W. Bell and Bob Olinger, then escaped from the Lincoln County, New Mexico jail. Eyewitness accounts say Billy the Kid fled with 2 six-shooters. He escaped to Fort Sumner, New Mexico, where he hid his revolver, Colt Single Action Serial Number 22334, in a tree. He told his friend Jesus Silva where it was hidden." End quote. Silva would later retrieve the pistol and kept it until making the trade with Brown. This information can be found in The Dirty on Billy the Kid by Steven Cedarwall. According to most historians, after Billy killed Bell and Olinger, he went into the armory and helped himself to two .44 caliber revolvers, which was his weapon of choice. The gun left in the fork in the tree was a .45 caliber, and I believe that this gun was most likely Bell's gun. According to Roberts, after walking out of the Lincoln County Jail, he entered the street and climbed into a horse that was waiting for him. Almost immediately, he slid off the opposite side and hung onto the rope. He then stated that, quote, "The Gallegos kid went down the road and took a rope off a yoke of steers in the field and tied the rope to my saddle." End quote. Following this, he rode out of Lincoln. On October 11, 1949, William V. Morrison interviewed Severo Gallegos, age 84, at Ruidoso, New Mexico, who confirmed Roberts' account. Gallegos stated that he, Miguel Luna, and Juan Alvarez were playing marbles in the shade tree by the jail when Bell was killed. Quote, "When Olinger ran across the street, we heard Billy talk to him and saw him shoot through the window. We were scared and ran. Billy called to me to help catch that horse back there. Goss, the jail cook, cut the chain on the leg irons, then caught the horse in the yard. He led the horse up, and I helped saddle him. Then Goss took the horse around to the front and into the street, where he was tied. Billy made a talk and got on the horse. The horse started to buck, and Billy fell off and held to the rope. He told me to go down the road and get that rope from Preciano, who had a rope tied over the horns of the cow near Dad Pepin's place. Preciano gave the rope to me, and I tied it around the neck of the horse and threw it on the saddle horn." End quote. According to W.C. Jameson in Billy the Kid Beyond the Grave, quote, "The event concerning the horse and the rope during the kid's escape from the Lincoln County Jail was never recorded by historians. Yet 68 years later, the only two men still alive in 1949 who were participants described it in exactly the same way." End quote. According to Roberts, after killing Bell and Olinger and making his escape from Lincoln, he headed west into a canyon and went to the home of a friend who cut the bolts in his leg irons. After his leg irons were removed, he hid in a nearby brush, thinking that a posse might be looking for him. He said that Eno Salazar brought him a blanket and some food. On October 11, 1949, William V. Morrison interviewed Mrs. Bernardo Salazar, the adopted daughter of Eno Salazar, who confirmed Roberts' account. She stated, quote, "Eno's cousin Scipio Salazar was the one who cut the bolts and hid the irons. The next morning, Eno was riding a horse when he heard Billy whistle from the ditch. Eno took the saddle blanket off and gave it to Billy to sleep on." End quote. When William V. Morrison and Brushy Bill Roberts visited the Lincoln County Courthouse in 1949, Roberts appeared nervous and disoriented. He told Morrison that the inside stairway was the same as it was in 1881, but that the two outside stairways on the front of the building leading to the second floor deck had been added. Roberts also added that the inside stairway started on the first floor on the west side of the building and ran toward the east and into a large hall on the second floor, which was oriented north-south. On the east side of the hall, he said, was Garrett's office. From there, another door opened into the room where he was held and chained. Across the hall from Garrett's office was the armory. In the R.N. Mullen collection housed at the J. Evetts Haley Center in Midland, Texas, an 1884 photograph of the courthouse taken from across the street and several yards to the northeast of the building shows only a single outside stairway leading from the second floor deck to the ground. The stairway appears to have been constructed sometime after the deck, as it appears to be of a different style and color. In Billy the Kid Beyond the Grave, W.C. Jameson cites an article by author J.W. Hendron titled "The Old Lincoln County Courthouse," which states, quote, "In the year 1878, there were no steps leading up to the porch on the second floor, and there was no roof over it. In April 1881, when Billy the Kid escaped from the courthouse, there were still no stairs on the outside of the building. Hendron says no one is certain how the kid left the courthouse. Some say he came down one of the pillars supporting the balcony, and others say he left by the back stairs. Stairs to the second floor balcony were only constructed in 1884, and at that time they consisted of according to Henron, a narrow staircase from the east end of the balcony, and several years later, presumably in the 1890s, 2 full-width staircases were built on both sides of the balcony in front, and a roof was built over Major Murphy's sun porch. By 1910, continues Henron, an old-timer who had not seen the Murphy-Dolan store since the days of the Lincoln County War would not have recognized it. End quote. Later research discovered an early floor plan of the building, along with a description of the interior, both of which support Robert's description of the appearance and layout of the building. During his visit, none of what he remembered about the courthouse was what was found on this part of the second floor, which today is open space with no walls or offices. Robert's knowledge of the layout of the Lincoln County Jail at the time of his famous escape seemed to impress the legendary Lincoln County War and Billy the Kid researcher and author Robert Mullen, as described in a letter from William B. Morrison to Mullen dated July 12, 1955, which states, quote, "You know it will be most enjoyable for me to play back the tapes when you are this way. I recall the special interest you took in them, and I shall never forget the thrill I enjoyed at the time you asked me to play them back on important statements made by Roberts. They had no special significance to me. I thought that Roberts' description of the arrangement of the jail and the events of the fighting at McSween's was generally known, until you said they may have been known to only to a few people." End quote. This letter serves 2 purposes. First, it confirms that Roberts' knowledge wasn't commonly known, and secondly, it debunks the claim made by neo-historians that no one other than Morrison ever listened to the tapes. It should be noted that in addition to being wrong in describing the details of the kid's escape from the Lincoln County Jail, Burns was also incorrect in his description of the building, stating that the second-story porch along the front of the building reached from the street by stairways at either end, when no such stairway existed at that time. The stairways were added after the kid had left the country. Robert's account of nearly killing Barney Mason is confirmed in Mary Hudson Brothers' book, Billy the Kid, the most hated, the most loved outlaw New Mexico ever produced, which contains the personal notes from her father, the late Belle Hudson, who witnessed, quote, "Barney Mason and Jim Curtin rode up on Billy in a sheep camp. Mason fled." End quote. This is further confirmed by William Kelleher in Violence in Lincoln County, who cites a May 12, 1881 Las Vegas Gazette article which states, quote, "It is reported that William Bonney, alias Kid, has been seen near Fort Sumner, riding a horse stolen from Bell's ranch. It is believed that Billy is on the lookout for Barney Mason, who was then in Fort Sumner. The Kid never having any great love for Barney, and especially since he assisted in the capture of Billy and party at Stinking Springs." End quote. In the book The Tragic Days of Billy the Kid, Fraser Hunt gives the most detailed account of the incident, which mirrors Robert's account, stating that while on his way to Fort Sumner, the Kid had stole a horse belonging to Montgomery Bell, who hired Barney Mason and a man named Carrington to track the horse down, thinking it had been stolen by a Mexican, when, quote, "Barney Mason, carrying a Winchester and 6-shooter, rode into a sheep camp with the unarmed Carrington at his side. Suddenly, Billy stepped out from the hut with a rifle in his hand, his sense of humor getting the best of his good judgment. Mason, whom the Kid despised, did exactly what Billy was sure he would do. He jerked his mount around and disappeared in a cloud of dust." End quote. Robert's claim that Celsa, Saville, and Apolinaria Gutierrez were all siblings was confirmed in a March 19, 1955 letter from William B. Morrison to Robert N. Mullen, which states, quote, "The records in San Miguel and Debaca counties will indicate that Saville, Celsa, and Apolinaria were all children of Dolores Gutierrez." End quote. This is important because many Billy the Kid authors and historians have at times incorrectly identified Saville and Celsa as husband and wife, rather than siblings. This is further confirmed in Fraser Hunt in The Tragic Days of Billy the Kid, who has Celsa refer to Saville as her brother. In the book, The Story of Billy the Kid by J.W. Hendron, it also confirms that Saville and Celsa were siblings, and that Billy spent time at the home of Charlie Baudry's widow, Manuela, stating, quote, "He spent the night at the old hospital building, where the widow of Charlie Baudry lived. The next morning, Saville Gutierrez was sent up to Los Canaditas to fetch one of Billy's sweethearts. She arrived a few days later and spent several days with him." End quote. This was Celsa Gutierrez, If she were Saville's husband, rather than her brother, is it likely that he would deliver his wife to the arms of another man? Roberts was also correct in stating that Apollinaria was Garrett's second wife. According to Frederick Nolan, in the Lincoln County War, a documentary history, Apollinaria Gutierrez and Pat Garrett were married on January 14, 1880, at Fort Sumner, New Mexico. Roberts was also correct in identifying the kid's known girlfriends. This is confirmed in Billy the Kid, The Endless Ride by Michael Wallace, which states that besides Paulita Maxwell, quote, the kid was linked romantically to other young women, Nasaria Yerby, Abrana Garcia, and Celsa Gutierrez, the sister of Pat Garrett's second wife, end quote. Author Fraser Hunt further confirms Roberts' claim that after escaping the Lincoln County Jail, Billy spent most of his time moving from one sheep camp to the other, periodically hooking up with Celsa Gutierrez, stating, quote, he spent most of his days and nights at one or another of the little sheep camps where he was always welcome. Now and again, he would slip into Sumner late at night and make his way to the doorway of the rooms where Celsa lived and always seemed to be waiting for him, end quote. Fraser later adds, quote, every time he saw Celsa, she tried to make him promise he would leave. Some of his old native friends at the sheep ranches where he stopped were likewise quietly urging him not to wait any longer. It was dangerous. He must go now, soon this night. He must not delay. Billy would thank them and promise he'd go soon. It was always that way. It was as if something bigger than he was kept holding him back, end quote. As for Burns' account of what Billy was doing following his escape from the Lincoln County Jail, the only similarity between Roberts' and Burns' accounts is he has Goss cutting the chain off his leg irons. He fails to mention the incident described by Gallegos about the kid sliding off the horse and fetching him a rope. He does acknowledge Gallegos as a witness to the shooting and escape, though. Instead, he sends Goss after a horse while he lounges about the courthouse yard smoking cigarettes. When Goss returns with a horse, Billy climbs up and the horse bucks him off, Billy landing on his hands and knees, still holding the bridle. Billy stands up, his hands on his guns, giving those that witnessed it a deathly stare. He then climbs back on the horse, waves goodbye, and slowly rides out of town, whistling a merry tune as he goes. Burns then has Billy going to the home of Jesus Jose Padilla, writing a note to Billy Burt, the man who owned the horse he escaped Lincoln on, and then sending the horse back with the note. Next he has Billy arriving at the home of Jose Cordoba, where Jose and Benito Rodriguez remove the leg irons. Burns then focuses on Garrett, learning of the kid's escape and meeting up with John Poe and Thomas McKinney, and then the trio goes searching for him, questioning people about him before arriving at Fort Sumner. Burns fails to mention the incident with Barney Mason, nor does he mention anything about any of the sheep camps Billy was staying or that he stayed with Manuela Beaudry. He also makes the mistake of referring to Celsa and Saville as husband and wife rather than siblings. This concludes the Outlaw years. As demonstrated in this series, few similarities exist between Roberts and Burns' accounts, only agreeing in generalities, and when the two accounts differ, Roberts' account is always the correct one. My next video will be a little different, and then I will be addressing the claim made by neo-historians that no reputable researcher or historian ever took Roberts' case seriously. Furthermore, I will be discussing Brushy Bill Roberts' books, authors, and researchers and their contributions to his case. After that, I will be covering the events of the shooting at Fort Sumner on July 14, 1881. Until next time, stay tuned, and thank you for watching.